Caroline Hale hit the boardwalk so hard her teeth cracked together and the ledger skidded out of her hands into the dirt. Harlan Bross stood over her in the doorway of his bank, straightening his cuffs. "Take your false accusations elsewhere," he said loud enough for the whole street to hear, "before I have you arrested for slander." Not one person on that street moved. Not one. 21 men and women watched her bleed from the cut above her eye, and every single one of them looked away. That was the morning Wade Calloway rode into Colton Creek. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The blood was getting into her eye by the time Caroline pushed herself upright. She didn't wipe it. She got to her feet, retrieved the ledger from the dirt, tucked it under her arm, and walked the length of the main street of Colton Creek, with her back straight and her jaw set, and she did not look at a single one of the people who had watched Harlan Bross put her on the ground and done nothing. She had learned long ago that looking at people who had failed you only made you want to weep, and she had no intention of weeping on a public street in front of any of them. Her office was a narrow room above Decker's feed store, reached by an outside staircase that groaned under her boots. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, set the ledger on her desk, and then sat down in her chair and pressed her sleeve against the cut above her eyebrow and waited for her hands to stop shaking. They took a while. The ledger on her desk was the Alderman family's mortgage contract, all 41 pages of it, and on page 37, buried in a paragraph of dense legal language that would have meant nothing to a farmer who'd never studied a law document in his life, was a clause that allowed the Colton Creek Savings and Trust to seize the property in full if the borrower missed a single payment by more than 10 days, not 30 days, not 60, 10. And below that clause, initialed in a hand that did not match Thomas Alderman's signature on any other page, was an agreement waiving the borrower's right to contest the seizure. Thomas Alderman had not initialed that clause. Caroline was certain of it. She had been looking at Thomas Alderman's handwriting for 3 years, and the initials on page 37 of his mortgage contract had been written by someone else entirely. She had walked into Harlan Bross's bank that morning with the contract in hand and told him exactly what she had found. She had been calm about it. She had laid the document on his desk and pointed to the page and said in the most measured voice she could manage that she believed there had been a clerical error in the preparation of the Alderman contract, and that she would like to discuss it with him. He had looked at the page, then he had looked at her, then he had picked up the ledger and struck her with it and told her to get out. She sat in her office for a long time after that, pressing her sleeve against the cut, thinking. She thought about the Alderman place, which had been seized 6 weeks ago, when Thomas missed a payment by 12 days, because the spring flooding had kept him from getting to town. She thought about the Pierce family who had lost their ranch the previous winter, under circumstances nobody in town seemed quite willing to discuss. She thought about the Henniger property east of the creek, standing empty now, and old Walt Henniger living in a room behind Ruth McAllister's store because he had nowhere else to go. She thought about her father, who had spent 30 years as a contract lawyer in Baltimore and taught her to read legal documents the way other fathers taught their daughters to read music. He had told her more than once that a forged signature was the oldest crime in the world and the hardest to prosecute because the people who committed it were always the same people who controlled the courts. Her father had been dead for 4 months. His office, his clients, his little practice in this scrubby Texas town he had retired to for the dry air and the quiet. All of it had passed to her because there was no one else, and because she had nowhere else to go, and because she was 32 years old, and had already made one catastrophic error in judgment about a man, and had no intention of leaving herself dependent on anyone else's goodwill ever again. She heard boots on the staircase outside. Her hand went to the desk drawer where she kept her father's derringer before the knock came. "Miss Hale." Ruth McAllister's voice low and careful. "It's only me." Caroline let out the breath she'd been holding. "Come in, Ruth." Ruth McAllister was 60 years old and built like a woman who had survived 3 decades of frontier life through sheer refusal to be defeated by it. She came through the door, took one look at the cut above Caroline's eye, crossed the room and pressed a clean folded cloth against it without a word. I saw, Ruth said after a moment. I know you did. I'm sorry, nobody. Don't. Caroline took the cloth from her and held it herself. I don't want apologies for other people's choices. Ruth sat down in the chair on the other side of the desk and folded her hands in her lap. What did you find? Enough to put Harlan Bross in a federal prison if I can get it in front of the right judge. Ruth was quiet for a moment. He's going to come after you now. You know that. He already did. Caroline nodded toward the cut. That was his opening offer. Caroline. Ruth's voice was very steady. I mean, he's going to come after you in ways that are harder to see coming than a man hitting you with a book. He'll go after your clients. He'll spread word that your numbers can't be trusted. He'll find a way to have your license questioned, and in this territory, a woman's license is always the first thing questioned. She paused. He's been doing this for 2 years at minimum. The Pierce Ranch, the Henniger place, now Thomas Alderman. He's systematic. And you just walked into his bank and told him, you know. The truth of that settled over Caroline like cold water. I know, she said quietly. Do you have copies of the contracts? I have the originals. The clients brought them to me. Keep them somewhere he can't get to. Ruth rose from the chair. And be careful going home tonight. She paused at the door. There's a man just rode in, tied his horse outside my store about an hour ago. Bought fence wire and grain, and didn't say much, but he's got the look of someone who's been places. She glanced back at Caroline. I mention it only because I've been keeping my eyes open for people who might not already be in Bross's pocket. After Ruth left, Caroline cleaned the cut above her eye with the water from the pitcher on her windowsill and studied herself briefly in the small mirror she kept on the shelf. The cut had stopped bleeding. It would bruise. She pinned her hair back up where it had come loose, straightened her collar, and picked up the Alderman contract again. She had work to do. It was late afternoon when she finally came downstairs, the ledger and 3 other contracts tucked inside her leather satchel, which she kept pressed against her side. The street was quieter now, the worst of the day's heat gone, a thin wind moving the dust along the boardwalk. She was walking toward the telegraph office, intending to send a wire to a federal land office contact her father had maintained in Austin, when she heard the raised voices coming from the direction of the livery stable. She recognized one of the voices. Dale Purvis. One of the 2 men who followed Harlan Bross around town like dogs following a butcher wagon. The other voice she did not recognize, flat, and even the kind of voice that didn't get louder when it was angry. She stopped at the corner and looked. Purvis was pointing a finger at a man standing near a dun-colored horse. A man lean and tall with a dark brown hat pulled low and a leather satchel of his own slung across one shoulder, fence wire coiled at his feet. Purvis had 2 inches and 40 pounds on him and was using both aggressively chest forward close enough to force the issue. I said the stable's full, Purvis said. You've got 4 empty stalls. The lean man's voice had not changed pitch at all. I can see them from here. My count's different than yours, stranger. I suggest you ride on. Your count's wrong. The lean man glanced briefly at the stalls, then back at Purvis. There was no anger in his face, no fear either, just a kind of settled watchfulness that Caroline recognized without quite being able to name. I'll pay the standard rate. My horse needs water and grain. Then water and grain her yourself somewhere else. Purvis stepped closer. We don't need your kind in Colton Creek. What kind is that? Purvis didn't answer, just held the stare, one hand dropping to his hip. What happened next was very fast and very quiet. The lean man's hand moved, not to his weapon, but to Purvis's wrist, and Purvis's hand was suddenly at an angle that made the larger man wince and step back, and then step back again. And the lean man simply walked past him into the stable, leading his horse. Purvis stood in the entrance, flexing his fingers and breathing hard, his face gone red. He looked up, and his eyes found Caroline standing at the corner, and his expression shifted from humiliated to something uglier. "Mind your own business, woman. I'm standing on a public street," Caroline said. "You're the one causing a disturbance." Purvis spat in the dirt and walked away. Caroline hesitated. She should go to the telegraph office. She had 3 contracts in her satchel and a federal contact in Austin, who might or might not respond to a wire before Harlan Bross moved to destroy her professionally, which Ruth had told her was already beginning to happen. She did not have time for curiosity about a man she'd never met. She walked to the stable entrance anyway. He was settling his horse in the far stall, checking her left foreleg with the focused attention of a man who took his animals seriously, and he didn't look up when Caroline stopped at the stall door. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting that go the way it was heading." He glanced up then, dark eyes steady. "Wasn't on your behalf, ma'am. I just needed a stall." "I know that." She studied him for a moment. "You're not from here." "Passing through." He went back to the horse's leg. "Buying fence wire suggests otherwise." He paused, then looked up at her again, and this time there was a brief consideration in his expression, as if he was deciding something. "I've got a place a few miles east. Moved out here last spring." He straightened. "Wade Calloway." "Caroline Hale." He looked at the bruise forming above her eye, without comment, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "You're the woman Bross threw out of the bank this morning," he said. "Word travels fast. Small town." He came out of the stall and latched it behind him, still looking at her with that careful, weighing attention. "What did you find in his books?" Caroline went still. "What makes you think I found something in his books? Man doesn't hit a woman in front of a street full of people over a social call." He leaned against the stall post and crossed his arms, and she noticed for the first time that there was nothing casual about his posture. It was the posture of a man who knew exactly where the exits were. "What did you find?" She should not tell a stranger what she had found. She knew that. She had known it for exactly the same reason Ruth had told her to keep the contracts somewhere safe. And yet, something in the flat steadiness of Wade Calloway's voice, the voice that had not gotten louder when he was being threatened, the voice that simply stated facts, made her think of her father, who had also had the habit of asking the most important question first. "Forged initials on a seizure clause," she said. "Thomas Alderman's mortgage. And I think it's not the first time." Wade was quiet for a moment. "How many properties?" "At least 3 that I can document, possibly more." "The Pierce Ranch." She looked at him sharply. "You know about the Pierce Ranch?" "I knew John Pierce." His jaw tightened briefly. "He came to me last winter, 2 weeks before he lost the property. Showed me his contract. Said something didn't look right, but he couldn't say what." A pause. "I couldn't read it well enough to tell him what was wrong. Legal language." He met her eyes. "You could have." "Yes," Caroline said quietly. "I could have." They stood in the dim stable with the horse shifting behind the stall door and the wind moving along the exterior walls, and Caroline understood that the conversation had taken a turn neither of them had intended. "What are you planning to do?" Wade asked. "I'm going to wire a contact in Austin, federal land office. If I can get the right eyes on these contracts, Bross goes to prison. And between now and when those federal eyes arrive..." She lifted her chin. "Manage. He's going to move against you first." Wade pushed off the stall post. "You know that. Ruth McAllister told me the same thing an hour ago. Ruth's right." He picked up his hat from the post where he'd set it and put it on, and the shadow of the brim fell across his eyes. "Do you have the contracts on you right now?" She tightened her hand on the satchel without meaning to. "That's none of your..." "It is, if you're walking home alone with them." His voice was still flat, still quiet, still completely even. "Purvis works for Bross. He just saw your face. And you just watched me embarrass him in front of the town." He looked at her steadily. "Those contracts need to be somewhere Bross can't reach them tonight." Caroline stared at him. "I don't know you. No, Wade agreed. You don't. You could be working for Bros yourself. I could be. He said it without any trace of offense, as if he understood completely why she would think it. Or I could be a man who knew John Pierce and couldn't help him because I didn't know what to look for. And you could be a woman who knows exactly what to look for and needs someone who can handle the part of this that doesn't happen in a courtroom. He paused. Your call, Miss Hale. Caroline looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what her father had taught her about reading a document, not just the words, but the weight of them, the deliberateness of how they'd been assembled, what they revealed about the person who'd written them. She thought about how to apply that same reading to a person standing in front of her. Wade Calloway had not tried to take the satchel from her hand. He had not told her what she should do. He had laid out the situation as he saw it, offered an observation, and said, "Your call." "There's a strongbox in my office," she said. "Bolted to the floor. Only I have the key." "Good." He nodded toward the stable door. "I'll walk with you to the telegraph office, then to your office. After that, you can decide whether you want any more of my company. What exactly do you get out of this, Mr. Calloway?" He was quiet for a beat. "John Pierce had 4 children," he said. "His wife took them to her sister's place in San Antonio because she had nowhere else to go. His oldest boy was 12. He picked up the coil of fence wire with one hand. "I get a chance to do something useful about that." They walked to the telegraph office side by side without speaking, Caroline composing the wire in her head. Wade a half step behind her, and to the left with his eyes on the street, the way a man watches a street when he has reason to watch it. She was aware of him, the way she was aware of a problem she had not yet solved, constantly at the edge of her attention, with a quality that was not quite comfort, and not quite distrust, but something unnamed between the two. The telegraph operator, a young man named Gus, looked up when they came in, and then looked at the bruise above Caroline's eye, and then looked very deliberately at his equipment. She wrote out the wire in careful, neutral language, the kind of language her father had taught her to use when the communication might be read by the wrong person before it reached the right one. She asked her contact in Austin to send a federal inspector to Colton Creek at the earliest opportunity, and referenced 3 property seizures by name. She paid Gus and folded the receipt and put it in her satchel. "How long for a reply?" Wade asked. "Day or 2, Gus said without looking up. Outside, the light was dropping toward evening, the sky going red and amber over the rooftops. Caroline turned toward her office, and Wade fell into step beside her. "If Bros has any sense," Wade said, "he'll have someone at the telegraph office first thing tomorrow morning. Gus won't tell him. Gus is 19 years old, and Bros holds the mortgage on his mother's house." Caroline stopped walking. She turned and looked at Wade Calloway in the failing light, and he looked back at her with an expression that was not satisfaction at being right, not condescension, not any of the many varieties of "I told you" that she had been collecting from men her entire adult life. He simply looked at her as he had looked at her from the beginning, steadily, with the full weight of his attention, as if what she thought and what she decided mattered. "I need to get copies of those contracts made tonight," she said. "Do you have the materials?" "I have carbon paper and a copying press in my office. I can write a fair hand." He held her eyes. "If you need the extra set." She studied him for another moment. There was no reason to trust Wade Calloway. She had known him for less than an hour. She had known her former fiancé for 2 years and had not seen clearly enough to protect herself from him until the damage was done. Her judgment about men had a documented failure rate that gave her every reason for caution. But her father had also taught her this: a forged document looks almost exactly like a real one in every detail except the ones you know how to find. The trick is knowing what you're looking for. The trick is having enough knowledge to see what's been hidden. She had spent an hour watching Wade Calloway. She had watched how he handled a physical threat from a bigger man. She had watched how he spoke to her, not at her, not around her, but to her, as if her opinion of the situation was a piece of relevant information. She had watched him name the thing she was most afraid of: Gus and the telegraph, and Bros reading her wire before it arrived without cruelty, without any attempt to leverage her fear. She thought about Thomas Alderman losing his family's land for a 12-day missed payment. She thought about John Pierce's 12-year-old boy and his mother in San Antonio. She thought about Walt Henniger sleeping in a room behind Ruth McAllister's store. She thought about her father pressing the Alderman contract into her hands 3 days before he died, and saying with the last of his breath that there was something wrong with it, that she should look carefully, that she was the only one left in Colton Creek who knew how. She turned toward the staircase above Decker's feed store. The copying press was a heavy iron thing that her father had hauled all the way from Baltimore, and it took both of them to operate it efficiently. Caroline positioning each page, Wade applying the pressure bar with the steady, controlled force of a man who understood machinery. They worked without talking much at first, the way people work when the task itself is serious enough to command full attention, and the only sounds in the small office were the creak of the press and the wind against the single window and the occasional knock of the lamp flame against the glass chimney. She watched his hands while he worked. They were the hands of a man who had done physical labor for years, scarred at the knuckles, calloused across the palm. But he handled the carbon paper with a lightness that surprised her, lifting each sheet cleanly without smearing. "You said you were a detective," she said, after they had finished the Alderman contract and moved to the Pierce documents. "Investigator." He set the pressure bar. "For a railroad company out of St. Louis, 7 years. "What kind of investigations?" "Contract fraud mostly, supply chain theft, occasionally witness tampering." He lifted the bar and peeled back the carbon sheet. "The kind of work that requires reading a lot of documents very carefully." Caroline looked up from the page she was positioning. "Then you could have read John Pierce's contract yourself." "I could read it well enough to know something was wrong." He met her eyes briefly. "Not well enough to prove it. There's a difference." "Nay?" He set the next sheet in place. "Your kind of reading and my kind of reading aren't the same thing." "No," she agreed. "They're not." They worked through the Pierce documents, and then started on the Henniger papers, which were the oldest of the three, and the most water-damaged. The ink faded in the lower corners, where the paper had been wet and dried more than once. Caroline had to hold the lamp close to read some of the language, and Wade leaned in beside her without being asked, his shoulder an inch from hers, squinting at the faded text with the same focused attention he had given everything else. "There," she said, pointing to the bottom of page 22. "You see the clause?" He read it in silence. Then he read it again. 10 days, he said. 10 days, same as the Alderman contract. Same language, almost word for word. And the initials. She pointed to the margin. He leaned closer, and she heard the shift in his breathing, a slight controlled change, the kind a person makes when anger is being held at a careful distance from action. "That's not Walt Henniger's hand," he said. "How do you know Walt Henniger's hand?" "He signed for a load of fence posts from me last fall. I've got the receipt in my saddlebag." He straightened. "Same name, completely different construction on the H." He looked at her. "How many of these has Bros done?" "I don't know yet. These 3 are the ones my father flagged before he died. There could be more going back years." She set the document carefully in the press. "The problem is, I can't subpoena his records. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not law enforcement. All I have are the contracts his victims brought to my father, and my father's notes, and my own reading of what I'm holding. And a federal inspector on the way from Austin." Wade watched her work the press. "If Gus doesn't tell Bros about the wire first." "If." She pulled the copied page free and set it to dry, "which is why we need to be done here and have these copies somewhere safe before morning." "Where bist you?" "Ruth's store." She picked up the next document. "She's got a root cellar Bros doesn't know about. Her husband dug it in '68 and never told anyone but family." Wade nodded slowly. Does Ruth know you're planning to use it? She offered it this afternoon. Caroline glanced at him. She's been watching this happen for 2 years. She just didn't have anything concrete enough to act on. She paused. Neither did I until last week. What happened last week? Thomas Alderman came to my office. She set the press bar and held it. He sat across this desk and he cried. He's 54 years old, and he cried like a man who has run completely out of road. His family has worked that land for 11 years. He built the house himself. He put 3 children through school from the income off that land. She released the bar. He brought me the contract because he couldn't understand why the bank had the right to take everything he'd built over 12 days. He thought maybe he'd missed something. Maybe it was his fault. Her voice was steady, but the muscles in her jaw were not. It wasn't his fault. Wade didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been. John Pierce said the same thing, that he must have missed something, that maybe he should have read it more carefully. They signed what they were handed by a man in a good suit sitting behind a large desk in a bank with brick walls. Caroline turned to face him fully. Harlan Bross has spent 20 years building a reputation for being respectable. People don't read the fine print on a document from a man they've been told they can trust. She held his gaze. That's the crime. Not just the forgery. The whole architecture of it. The reputation, the suit, the brick walls. He built a machine for stealing from people who had no reason not to believe him. Wade looked at her for a long beat. You sound like your father. She went still. What? The way you just described it. Architecture of the crime. A slight shift in his expression, not quite a smile, something more careful than that. My supervisor in St. Louis used to say something similar, that the best fraud is a building, not a single act. You have to dismantle the whole structure before you can prove anything. He paused. How old were you when your father started teaching you this work? 12. She turned back to the documents. He had no sons. He said that was the world's good fortune and his. Smart man. He was. She positioned the next page. He was also dying of a lung condition for the last 2 years of his life, which is why he didn't pursue this himself when he first saw the Alderman contract. He was trying to get his affairs in order. She said it without sentimentality, the flat statement of a woman who had processed grief into fact. He left me his practice, and his files, and his copying press, and 17 years of case notes. And the Alderman contract with a note clipped to the front that said, Caroline, this is wrong. Find out how wrong. The lamp flame wavered in a draft from under the door. They both looked at the door at the same moment. Wade moved first, crossing the room in 3 steps, without a sound, positioning himself to the side of the door, rather than in front of it, one hand at his hip. Caroline set down the page she was holding and moved to the left of the desk, putting solid wood between herself and the entrance. A knock, 2 sharp raps. Miss Hale. Ruth McAllister's voice, lower than usual and slightly breathless. It's Ruth. Don't open until I tell you who's behind me. Who's behind you, Ruth? Nobody. A pause. But Dale Purvis was standing outside the feed store 20 minutes ago, looking up at your window. I went around the long way. Another pause, and Caroline heard her breathing. Can I come in? Caroline looked at Wade. He nodded and stepped to the side of the frame. She crossed and unlocked the door, and Ruth came through it quickly, her shawl pulled tight, and her face composed in the deliberate way of a woman controlling an emotion she doesn't intend to display. Ruth took in the copied documents spread across every flat surface. The carbon paper, the press, and Wade Calloway standing against the wall. She looked at him with the particular assessment of a woman who has spent 60 years deciding in the first minute of meeting a person whether they are going to be a problem. Wade Calloway, he said. I've got a place east of town. I know who you are, Ruth said. You bought a load of fence posts from John Pierce last fall. He mentioned you. She looked at Caroline. How much do you have copied? Henniger, Pierce, and Alderman. Almost done. Do the rest tomorrow. You need to get what you have to my cellar tonight. Ruth moved to the desk and looked at the copied pages without touching them. Purvis doesn't watch windows for his own entertainment. Bross sent him. We know, Wade said. Ruth glanced at him again this time with a fractional adjustment in her expression that might have been approval. You two go down the back way. I'll go out the front and make enough noise about my aching feet that anyone watching will be looking at me. She straightened. Give me 5 minutes, then come. She left the way she'd come, and they heard her boots on the stairs, slow and heavy and deliberate, accompanied by a muttered commentary about the state of her knees that was just loud enough to carry. Caroline began gathering the copied documents, organizing them in order wrapped in the clean cloth she used to protect papers from moisture. Wade held the satchel open for her to slide them in, then buckled it and handed it back. She did not comment on the fact that he handed it back, rather than holding onto it, but she noticed it. Back stairs or through the storage room, she said quietly. After you. The alley behind Decker's feed store was narrow and dark, the ground uneven, and Caroline moved through it with the careful efficiency of someone who had walked it often enough to know where to step. Wade stayed close behind her without crowding, and she was aware of him as a physical presence in the darkness. The controlled quiet of his movement. The absence of the kind of noise that careless people made. Ruth's store was 3 buildings down, and they came in through the back door that Ruth had left unlatched into the storeroom, that smelled of dried corn and coal oil, and the particular aged wood smell of a building that had stood in the same place for 20 years. Ruth was already there, a small lantern in her hand, leading them to the root cellar door, set into the floor in the far corner. The cellar was cool and dry, the walls lined with shelves of preserved food, and in the back corner behind a row of pickle crocks, Ruth had already cleared a space. Caroline knelt and set the wrapped documents on the shelf, checking the cloth for moisture, pressing her palm against the stone wall beside it. It stays dry, Ruth said from behind her. Even in the spring flood. My husband built it right. Caroline stood. If anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, Ruth said with the firmness of a woman who had decided this was the case. If something does, Caroline continued in the same even tone, the copies are here and the originals are in the strongbox in my office, and the key is on the chain I wear around my neck. The federal contact in Austin is a man named Arthur Delaney. His wire address is in the top drawer of my desk in the back, written on the inside cover of a book on contract law. She paused. Tell him what my father found. Show him the alderman contract first. The forged initials on page 37 are the clearest evidence. Ruth looked at her for a long moment, then looked at Wade, then back at Caroline. Your father would be proud of you, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. Caroline did not trust herself to respond to that, so she nodded once and turned toward the stairs. Back in the alley, the night had gone fully dark, the stars hard and white above the narrow strip of sky between the rooftops. Wade fell into step beside her, and they walked in silence for half a block before he spoke. You've been planning for this possibility for a while, he said. The instructions you left with Ruth. That's not something you thought of tonight. Since last week, she said, when I finished reading the alderman contract. And the derringer in your desk drawer. She glanced at him. Since 6 months after my father died, when I started to understand what he'd left me in those files. He was quiet for a few steps. How much do you sleep? The question surprised her enough that she almost smiled. Not much. No. He said it as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. Miss Hale, Caroline. She said it before she'd decided to. Under the circumstances, you might as well. A brief pause. Caroline. He said it without ceremony, without the slight emphasis some men put on a woman's given name to signal a familiarity they had not earned. He said it the way he said everything, flat and direct, as if it was simply what she was called. What happens tomorrow morning when Bross finds out the wire went through? He'll try to discredit me publicly, question my competence. He's already been planting doubt about my work according to Ruth. She kept her eyes on the street ahead. He'll probably try to get my clients to pull their accounts. And if he does more than that, then I deal with what he does. You don't have to deal with it alone." She stopped walking. It was not said with any particular weight. He hadn't slowed or turned to face her, hadn't positioned it as an offer requiring a response. He had simply stated it the way he stated everything, as a fact about the situation that seemed to him relevant. She looked at him in the dim light from the saloon window down the street. He was watching her with that same careful weighing attention, the attention that never felt like surveillance, that felt instead like the closest thing she had experienced in a long time to being genuinely seen. "I'm aware of that," she said carefully. "Are you?" He said it without the inflection of a question. "I've been aware of it for approximately 4 hours," she said, and something in her voice shifted slightly, without her intending it, to a fraction of the careful, controlled honesty that she usually reserved for balance sheets and legal documents. "I'm still deciding what to do with the information." Wade Calloway looked at her for a moment, and in the faint light, she saw the edge of something in his expression that was not his usual steadiness, something briefly unguarded there, and then managed back into place. "Fair enough," he said quietly. They walked the rest of the way to the boarding house on Clement Street, where Caroline rented a room from a widow named Mrs. Foss, without speaking again. At the gate, she stopped and turned. "My office at 7, she said. "I need to finish copying the remaining documents before Bross makes his first move." "I'll be there." She studied him one more time in the darkness. "Why did you come to Colton Creek, Mr. Calloway?" "The truth of it." He was quiet for a beat. "I was tired of watching what I knew how to find and not having someone beside me who knew what to do with it once I found it." He held her eyes. "And I was tired of being a man who let things go that shouldn't be let go. Because it was easier. Because it wasn't my fight." His jaw tightened briefly. "John Pierce made it my fight. I just didn't know it yet when I rode away from his door last winter." She stood with that for a moment. 7 o'clock, she said again, and went inside. Upstairs in her room, she sat at the small table by the window and opened her father's case notes to the page where he had written, in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who knew his time was running short. "There is a system here. Find it all. Don't stop at what's easy to prove. Go to the bottom of it." She thought about Wade Calloway's hands on the copying press, steady and careful. She thought about the way he had handed her the satchel instead of keeping it. She thought about the 12-year-old boy in San Antonio who had watched his family's land disappear because a man in a good suit had forged 2 initials on page 37 of a contract. She put her hand flat on her father's notes and made herself a promise, the way she had been making herself promises since she was 12 years old. Sitting across a desk from a man who believed she could learn anything, she would not stop at what was easy to prove. She would go to the bottom of it. She was already at the copying press when he arrived at 7, her hair pinned back, the lamp-lit, 3 new documents spread across the desk in the order she intended to work through them. He came through the door, set 2 cups of coffee from the diner down on the corner of the desk. Without a word, hung his hat on the hook by the door, as if he had been doing it for years, and picked up the first document. They worked through the morning the same way they had worked through the night, efficiently, without wasted motion. The press moving and the carbon sheets accumulating in careful stacks. Caroline copied. Wade organized the completed pages, checking each one against the original for clarity, flagging any sheet where the impression had gone faint at the edges. She noted the instinct of a man trained to look at documents as evidence, rather than paperwork, handling each page by the corners, keeping the stacks in sequence, noting on a separate slip of paper the date, and identifying information for each contract. "You did this kind of work every day," she said, watching him catalog the Reinhold family mortgage, which was the 4th contract and the most recently written, dated only 8 months ago. 7 years of it. He set the slip with the others. "Though mostly I was the one looking for the fraud, not copying evidence of it." "What's the difference from your end? In investigation work, you're building a case forward. You start with a suspicion, and you collect toward proof." He picked up the next document. What you're doing is building a case backward. You already have the proof. You're working out the full scope of it." He glanced at her. "It's harder in some ways. Harder to know when you have enough. My father used to say that you have enough when a jury of 12 people with no legal training could look at what you've assembled and agree in under an hour." Smart man. He said it the same way he'd said it the night before, without flattery as a plain assessment. He was. She positioned the next page. "What made you leave the railroad company?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he set down the document he was holding and looked at the wall above the desk, and his expression had the particular flatness of a man recalling something he has spent time learning to carry without being carried by it. "I found evidence of contract manipulation on a land acquisition the company was running in Missouri. 43 families displaced for a rail line extension. The company had falsified the government survey results to make the land appear less productive than it was, which kept the compensation offers low." He picked up the document again. "I brought the evidence to my supervisor. He thanked me, told me he'd handle it, and 3 days later I was handed a letter informing me my position had been eliminated." What happened to the 43 families? They took what they were offered, because they didn't have anyone who knew what to look for in a government survey falsification. His jaw set. "And because by the time I understood what my supervisor intended to do with my report, the settlement papers were already signed." Caroline looked at him. "How long ago was that?" 3 years. "And you've been here since?" "Drifted for a year. Ended up here." He turned the page in his hands. "Land was cheap, and I was tired of cities." She held his gaze for a moment. "And now you're sitting in a woman's office at 7 in the morning copying evidence against a fraudulent banker." "Appears so." The corner of his mouth moved brief and controlled. "You have any objection to that?" "Not at the moment." She turned back to the press. They finished the remaining contracts by 9:30. Caroline wrapped the copies in oilcloth, and Wade carried them to Ruth's cellar while she locked the originals in the strongbox and put the key back on its chain. She was buttoning her collar when she heard boots on the stairs heavier than Wade's, more than one set, and her hand went to the desk drawer before she stopped herself and stood up straight. The door opened without a knock. Dale Purvis came in first, and behind him, a man she recognized as Clement Dodd Bross's clerk, carrying a leather document case. Behind Dodd came Harlan Bross himself. In his good suit, his expression arranged in the particular way of a man who has decided that a conversation is going to go badly for the other party, and has made his peace with it. Caroline stood behind her desk and did not move. "Miss Hale." Bross closed the door behind him. "I hope we're not interrupting your work." "You are," she said, "but I suspect that's the point." Bross glanced around the office at the copying press at the lamp still burning, at the desk cleared of everything except the locked strongbox. His eyes rested on the strongbox for a moment before moving back to her face. "I've come to discuss yesterday's unfortunate incident. You struck me with a ledger and had me thrown out of your bank. You came into my bank making unfounded accusations about my business practices." His voice was even and reasonable, the voice of a man addressing a misunderstanding. "I reacted poorly. I apologize for that." He said it without any particular sincerity, the apology a tool being deployed rather than a feeling being expressed. "What I cannot apologize for is the position your accusations have put me in." "What position is that?" Dodd opened the document case and removed a folded paper, which he set on the desk. Caroline did not touch it. "3 of my clients," Bross said, "have come to me in the past 2 weeks asking questions about their mortgage contracts. Questions that I have learned originated from conversations with you." He nodded toward the paper. "That document is a formal complaint filed with the Colton Creek Town Council this morning, alleging that you have been engaged in a pattern of conduct designed to undermine confidence in the Colton Creek Savings and Trust and interfere with lawful financial instruments." Caroline looked at the paper. Then she looked at Bross. "You filed a complaint with the town council." "I did." A town council whose chair is your brother-in-law. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and controlled. The composition of the town council is not relevant to the validity of the complaint. It's relevant to the outcome. She still had not touched the paper. What exactly are you alleging that I've done? Spread false information about the bank's practices to clients with the intent of causing financial damage to the institution. He paused. In this territory, that's actionable as slander, Miss Hale, potentially as fraud, given that some of your clients pay you for financial advice. Purvis was standing near the door with his arms crossed, watching her with the expression of a man who has been promised something entertaining. Caroline picked up the paper, unfolded it, and read it. She read the entire thing, every clause, every citation, at the pace of a woman who had been trained not to skim legal documents, even under pressure. Bross watched her read it. Dodd shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Purvis examined the ceiling. She folded the paper and set it back on the desk. This cites testimony from 2 witnesses, she said, neither of whom is identified by name. It references financial documents purporting to show damage to the bank's accounts, but includes no copies of those documents. It invokes a territorial statute on commercial slander that was amended in 1876 in a way that significantly narrows its application. She met Bross's eyes. This complaint would not survive a preliminary hearing before a qualified judge. Fortunately, Bross said, the preliminary hearing will be conducted by the town council. Whose chair is your brother-in-law? He smiled. It was the smile of a man who has stopped pretending. I'm going to suggest, Miss Hale, that you consider the practical realities of your situation. You are a woman practicing alone in a town where your credibility depends entirely on the goodwill of the community. That goodwill is a fragile thing. He glanced again at the strongbox. I would hate to see it damaged irreparably over a misunderstanding. Is that what this is, a misunderstanding? It could be. He held her gaze. Your father was a respected man. His practice had a good name. It would be a shame to see that name become associated with professional misconduct. He picked up the folded complaint from the desk. I'm prepared to withdraw this filing, in exchange for a public acknowledgement that your reading of certain mortgage documents was in error, and an agreement to refer any clients with questions about their bank contracts directly to my office in the future. The room was very quiet. Caroline looked at Harlan Bross and thought about Thomas Alderman sitting across this desk crying. She thought about page 37 of the Alderman contract and the initials that were not Thomas Alderman's initials and her father's note clipped to the front of the file. She thought about Walt Henniger sleeping in a room behind Ruth's store and John Pierce's 12-year-old boy and 43 families in Missouri who signed papers because they didn't have anyone who knew what to look for. No, she said. Bross looked at her for a moment, the smooth surface of his expression perfectly maintained. Then he put the complaint back in the document case and nodded to Dodd. I'm sorry to hear that. He moved toward the door. The hearing will be scheduled for the end of the week. I would advise you to retain legal counsel. He paused with his hand on the door. Though I understand there's only one attorney within 40 miles of Colton Creek, and he keeps his accounts at my bank. He opened the door. Good morning, Miss Hale. They left. Purvis went last, giving her a long look as he pulled the door shut behind him. Caroline stood behind her desk for a moment, in the sudden quiet, both hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. Then she took a breath, picked up her father's case notes, and went to find Wade. She found him at the bottom of the outside staircase, which told her he had been there long enough to know Bross had come and gone. He looked at her face and didn't ask if she was all right. What did he want? He said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, leaning against the wall beside the staircase, arms crossed, the particular stillness of a man processing information and not yet finished with it. He filed a complaint with the town council this morning, he said when she finished, before he came here. He wanted me to know the complaint already existed. She shifted the case notes under her arm. He's not worried about the federal inspector. Or he doesn't know the wire went through. He knows. Wade's voice was very flat. Gus Weber came out of the telegraph office this morning at 6:30 and walked straight to the bank. I watched him do it from the diner window. He paused. That means Bross knows you've contacted Austin, and he decided his best move was to go after your credibility before the inspector arrives, not after. Caroline felt the full weight of that settle on her. If the inspector arrives and I'm already under a formal complaint for professional misconduct, your testimony about the contracts is compromised. Wade nodded. That's the play. He can't stop the inspector from coming. He can make sure that when the inspector arrives, the main witness against him looks like a woman with a personal vendetta and a professional misconduct charge. How long do I have before the hearing? End of the week, you said. 5 days. She looked at him. I need something that establishes the forgery independently of my testimony. Physical evidence that doesn't depend on a jury believing my interpretation of the documents. He was quiet for a moment. The initials. If you could prove handwriting forgery through comparison with another source. I need samples of Bross's handwriting that predate the contracts. Something he signed before he started falsifying, so he can't claim the samples were altered. She pressed her hand against the case notes. And I need a legitimate handwriting expert to compare them, someone whose credentials Bross's brother-in-law can't dismiss. The Federal Land Office in Austin would have a document examiner. If the inspector brings one. She started walking and he fell into step beside her. If the inspector comes at all, if Bross hasn't already wired Austin himself to suggest the complaint is the work of a disgruntled woman with a history of professional disputes. Does he know about St. Louis? Wade said. She stopped. What? My former employer, the railroad company. He kept his eyes on the street ahead. If Bross looked into my background before sending Purvis to the stable last night, he might know I was dismissed, might know why. He paused. Which means he could use it. 2 witnesses against him, both with reasons to be hostile to financial institutions. Both with professional histories he can characterize as unstable, Caroline said, or vindictive. Yes. They walked in silence for half a block. The street around them was going about its ordinary business, and she was acutely aware of how ordinary it looked. The blacksmith smoke, the wagon traffic, the women on the boardwalk with their marketing baskets, while beneath the surface of it, something was being dismantled that these people did not yet know they were going to need. Ruth, Caroline said. What about her? She's been here 30 years. Her husband was on the original town charter. She has no financial relationship with Bross's bank. She kept her accounts with the land office in Austin after her husband died because he didn't trust local banking. Caroline was moving faster now. She's a witness whose credibility Bross can't easily attack, and she's been watching this happen for 2 years. She knows things about the sequence of those land seizures that I don't know yet. You think she kept records? I think she's a woman who has been watching a pattern she didn't fully understand, and women who watch patterns tend to write things down. She turned toward Ruth's store. I should have asked her sooner. I was focused on the contracts. You were right to be focused on the contracts. I was focused on what I knew how to read. She glanced at him. You're better at the other kind. The people-shaped evidence. You said it yourself, your kind of reading and my kind aren't the same. He held the door of Ruth's store open for her without responding, which was, she had come to understand his way of indicating agreement without ceremony. Ruth was behind her counter tallying a ledger when they came in, and she looked up and read their faces and closed the ledger. Sit down, she said in the tone of a woman who has been waiting for bad news and has already begun preparing for it. Both of you, and tell me everything he said. They sat. Caroline told her. Ruth listened with her hands folded on the counter and her expression arranged in the deliberate composure of a woman who has survived enough to know that composure is a tool. When Caroline finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she rose from behind the counter and went into the back room, and they heard the sounds of a chest being opened, papers being moved, the particular rustling of documents that have been kept carefully and referred to rarely. She came back with a wooden box, the kind used for storing correspondence, and set it on the counter. My husband kept records of every land transaction in this county from 1859 to 1871, she said. When he died, I kept them. Out of sentiment, mostly. She opened the box. Harlan Bross started at the Colton Creek Savings and Trust in 1873 as assistant manager. He became manager in 1875 when old Gerald Marsh retired. She began laying papers on the counter, sorted and deliberate. These are the deed records my husband filed for every property in the county. Dates of original purchase, names of buyers, assessed values. She set a second stack beside the first. And these are the notices of foreclosure and property transfer that have been filed with the county clerk's office in the past 4 years, which any member of the public can request, and which I have been requesting quarterly since the Pierce property transferred. Caroline leaned forward and looked at the two stacks. The first stack was thick, covering 12 years of ordinary property transfers. The second stack, covering 4 years, was nearly as thick. She put her hand flat on the second stack and felt the weight of it. "Ruth," she said quietly. "I know." Ruth's voice was steady. "I didn't know what I was looking at for the first year. I thought it was bad luck, a run of hardship." She straightened. "By the second year, I knew it wasn't luck." "Why didn't you go to the marshal?" Wade asked. Ruth looked at him. "The marshal keeps his savings at Bross's bank. His wife's family has a mortgage on their property." She paused. "I went to your father," she said to Caroline, 8 months before he died. I sat across his desk, and I showed him what I had, and I asked him if I was seeing what I thought I was seeing." Her voice shifted slightly, carrying something that was not quite grief and not quite guilt. "He told me I was. He said he would handle it, and then he got sicker." She looked down at the papers. "And then he was gone. And you were still learning the practice. And I thought—" She stopped. "You thought I wasn't ready," Caroline said, not accusatory, just the fact of it. "I thought you were grieving," Ruth said. "And I thought giving you one more weight to carry might be the weight that—" She didn't finish. Caroline looked at the stacks of paper on Ruth's counter and at Ruth's hands, which were not entirely steady, and understood that Ruth McAllister had been carrying this for 8 months alone because she had been trying to protect her. "I'm not breakable," Caroline said. Her voice was quiet and very certain. "I need you to know that." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, a single firm movement, the nod of a woman adjusting her understanding. "No," Ruth said. "I can see that you're not." Wade had picked up the top sheet from the transfer stack and was reading it, his eyes moving with the focused speed of a man who knew what he was looking for. He set it down and picked up another. Set it down. His jaw tightened incrementally, with each page the controlled anger she had seen the night before, returning in the same, careful-held way. 16 properties, he said. In 4 years. 16? Ruth confirmed. Caroline reached across the counter and picked up the first sheet from the original deed records. Then she found the corresponding transfer notice in the second stack. She held them side by side under the lamp and looked at the dates, the names, the assessed values, and the sale prices at transfer. The numbers told a story as clearly as any forged initial on any page 37. "He bought every seized property through a land company," she said. "Colton Creek Land Associates." She looked at Wade. "Do you know that name?" "Never heard of it." He took the 2 sheets from her and looked at them. "Who are the principals?" "That's what we need to find out." She looked at Ruth. "Can I take these?" "I've been waiting 4 years for someone to ask me that question," Ruth said, and began helping her gather them up. Colton Creek Land Associates turned out to be a single page filed with the county clerk's office in the spring of 1875. 2 months after Harlan Bross became bank manager, listing 2 principals. Harlan J. Bross and a man named Theodore Warfield address given as St. Louis, Missouri. Caroline read the filing twice at the clerk's office while Wade stood at the counter beside her. And then she wrote the name, Theodore Warfield, on a slip of paper and folded it into her pocket without changing her expression, because the clerk was a young man named Peters, who ate lunch every day at the diner where Bross's wife held a weekly women's social, and she had no intention of giving anyone in this building a reason to report what she had found before she had finished finding it. They walked out into the street, and she handed Wade the slip of paper. He read it. Then he went very still in the particular way she had come to recognize as his version of a reaction he was managing rather than displaying. "You know that name?" she said. "Theodore Warfield." He said it slowly, as if the name had a taste he was deciding about. He was Senior Vice President of Acquisition at the Missouri and Western Railroad Company. He paused. "The company I worked for." Caroline stood with that for a moment. The street went about its business around them, entirely indifferent. "He was your supervisor," she said. "He was the man who took my report and buried it and had me dismissed." Wade's voice was very flat, the flatness of something held under significant pressure. "He's the man who let 43 families in Missouri take inadequate settlements because he had a financial interest in keeping the acquisition costs low." He folded the slip of paper and put it in his jacket pocket. "And now, he's a principal in a land company in Colton Creek, Texas, in partnership with the manager of the local bank." "The railroad," Caroline said. "The railroad." He nodded. "The Texas and Pacific has been trying to extend its line westward through this county for 2 years. I've read about it in the papers. There have been negotiations with landowners that haven't gone anywhere because the landowners want fair market value, and the railroad doesn't want to pay it." He looked at her steadily. 16 properties seized in 4 years. Bought at pennies on the dollar through a land company whose silent partner is a railroad acquisition executive, and then sold to the railroad at full market value. Caroline pressed her hand against the papers she was carrying. "With the difference going into Bross and Warfield's pockets." "That's a federal crime," Wade said. "Not a territorial council hearing. Not a local complaint. Railroad land fraud in interstate commerce is federal jurisdiction. Which is why Arthur Delaney needs to bring more than a land inspector from Austin. She was already moving toward the telegraph office. He needs to bring a federal marshal." Wade caught her arm, not hard, just enough to stop her forward motion. She looked at him. "Not the telegraph office," he said quietly. "Bross already knows about Delaney. If you send another wire from here, he'll know we've found the railroad connection before we've secured the evidence." He looked down the street. "Is there another way to reach Austin?" she thought. "The stage line runs through Millhaven 14 miles east. They have a telegraph office that isn't connected to anyone in Colton Creek. How long to get there? 2 hours by horse, longer by wagon." His eyes moved to her face with the directness she had stopped finding startling. "Can you ride?" "I've been riding since I was 8 years old." "Then we go to Millhaven." He glanced at the papers under her arm. "And we take the filing with us. I want Delaney to have the name Warfield before he arrives." She almost said something about the hearing about the 5 days that had become 4, about Bross's brother-in-law on the council, and the marshal with his mortgage, and the 40-mile radius of Harlan Bross's quiet systematic influence. Then she thought about her father's note. Go to the bottom of it. She thought about what the bottom actually looked like, now that she could see it clearly, not just a crooked banker in a small Texas town, but a railroad company, and a man in St. Louis, and a pattern that had been running for years across 2 states. "I need to tell Ruth where we're going," she said. "Meet me at the livery in 20 minutes." She went to Ruth's store and found her at the counter, and told her quickly, keeping her voice low even though the store was empty of customers. Ruth listened, and then did something Caroline had not expected. She reached across the counter and gripped Caroline's hand briefly and firmly, the grip of a woman communicating something she had decided words were insufficient for. "Be careful," Ruth said, releasing her hand. "Purvis was watching your staircase again this morning. If he sees you ride out with Calloway, he'll report it to Bross. Who will want to know where you're going and why?" Ruth's jaw was set. "I'll find a way to keep him occupied. Give you the time you need." She paused. "How long will you be gone?" "We'll be back before dark if nothing goes wrong." She picked up her satchel. "If something goes wrong." "I know," Ruth said. The cellar. Arthur Delaney, page 37. She met Caroline's eyes. "Go." Wade had saddled both horses by the time she reached the livery, a dark roan from the livery stock for her alongside his own dun mare. He checked the cinch on her saddle, with the automatic care of a man who had spent years in the habit of verifying things himself, rather than trusting they'd been done correctly, and she found she did not object to it. They rode out the east road at an easy pace, unhurried enough not to draw attention, and it wasn't until Colton Creek had dropped behind the first rise that Wade let the mare move into a proper road gate, and Caroline brought the roan alongside. The land east of town was open and rolling, and the sky above it was the immense, uncomplicated blue of a Texas morning without weather. She was aware in the middle of everything else she was carrying of a sensation she had not experienced in a long time. Something close to relief, or perhaps simply the physical fact of being in motion after days of sitting at a desk with a weight that had no edges. "Tell me about Warfield," she said when they had ridden in silence long enough for the town to feel genuinely behind them. Wade was quiet for a moment, assembling it. 50 years old. Came up through the legal department of the railroad, which is why he was useful for acquisition work. He knew how to structure a purchase to make it look like an arm's-length transaction when it wasn't. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. He had 3 or 4 men he used regularly for fieldwork men, who would go into a county, establish relationships with local officials, identify the properties the railroad wanted, and set up the mechanisms for acquiring them at below-market prices. He paused. "I didn't know that's what they were doing when I was hired. I thought I was investigating supply fraud and billing irregularities. I was good at finding those because that's what I'd been told to look for. And when you found the survey falsifications instead, I had stumbled into the other operation without realizing it." His jaw tightened. "Warfield didn't know I was looking in that direction. When I brought him the evidence, his first question wasn't 'How bad is it?' It was 'How did you find this?'" He looked at her briefly. "That's when I understood the shape of what I'd walked into. You didn't go to anyone else at the company. I went to the company's general counsel. 2 days later I was dismissed, and the general counsel resigned to take a position with a law firm that held a significant railroad retainer." He said it without bitterness, with the flat acceptance of a man who has processed an injustice long enough to see it clearly without it consuming him. "That's when I understood that there wasn't a clean part of that organization to appeal to. And you left. And I left." He glanced at her. "I've thought about it every day since, whether there was something else I could have done. Whether I should have gone directly to a federal office instead of trying to use internal channels." He paused. "Your father understood that. Going straight to the right authority with clean evidence, not through the compromised institutions first. He spent 30 years watching people use compromised institutions to protect themselves," Caroline said. "He used to tell me that the first question to ask in any legal dispute is not who is right. It's who controls the process for deciding who is right." She watched the road ahead. "In Colton Creek, Bross controls the process, which is why we go around him. Through Delaney in Austin. Through Delaney and the federal jurisdiction and the name Theodore Warfield, which will mean something to a federal land office in a way that a local complaint about a territorial school teacher's finances does not." Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're not afraid of him." She considered that. "I'm afraid of the hearing, of Bross's brother-in-law and the counsel and the marshal who won't act and the clients who'll pull their accounts the moment the complaint becomes public." She felt the road under the roan's hooves, the steady rhythmic certainty of forward motion. "I'm not afraid of Harlan Bross himself. A man who forges initials in a fine print clause is a man who can't win a fair fight. Everything he's built depends on nobody looking carefully enough." She paused. I look carefully. It's the only thing I've ever been sure I'm good at. It's not the only thing, Wade said. It was not a flattery. It was an observation stated in the same direct register as everything else he said, and it landed differently than flattery would have. She did not answer it, but she felt it settle somewhere under her careful composure and stay there. They reached Millhaven in just under 2 hours, a town 3 times the size of Colton Creek, with a proper main street and a railroad depot and a telegraph office that occupied the front room of the post office building. The operator was a middle-aged woman with spectacles who took their wire without comment and sent it with the efficiency of someone who had been sending urgent messages for a living long enough to have no curiosity about their contents. Caroline had written 2 wires. The first to Arthur Delaney, naming Warfield, requesting a federal marshal accompany the land inspector, and giving the date of the council hearing as a deadline. The second to the Federal Land Records Office, requesting confirmation of the incorporation documents for Colton Creek Land Associates and any related filings under Warfield's name. She paid for both and received confirmation receipts, which she folded and put in her satchel alongside the copies they had brought. Outside the telegraph office, Wade bought them coffee from a counter inside the depot, and they stood with it in the strip of shade beside the building, and Caroline felt the particular stillness that comes after an action has been taken and the waiting has begun. If Delaney moves quickly, Wade said, he could have someone here by day after tomorrow. And if he doesn't move quickly enough, the hearing happens, and Bross uses it to establish a public record of misconduct before any federal authority arrives. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I've been trying to calculate which is more likely. What does your calculation come out to? Bross is smarter than he looked this morning, she said. He came to my office with a prepared complaint and a witness list and a settlement offer in that sequence. He's been planning this response since I walked into his bank yesterday, which means he had contingency plans already in place. She looked at Wade. He expected to be found eventually. He's been operating this scheme for 4 years in a county where my father was practicing law. He knew my father was looking at the alderman contract. She paused. He may have known more about my father's health and the timeline of his decline than I'm comfortable with. Wade looked at her steadily. You think he was waiting for your father to die. I think he factored it into his planning. She said it carefully, feeling the edge of something she had been approaching for days without letting herself look directly at it. My father had the skills to expose him. I have the same skills. He underestimated me because I'm not my father. I'm younger. I'm a woman. I don't have 30 years of professional reputation in this county. She set down the coffee cup. He hit me with a ledger and threw me out of his bank in front of a street full of witnesses because he calculated that the damage to my credibility would be greater than the damage to his from the act itself. Her voice was very steady. In most circumstances, that calculation would have been correct. It's not most circumstances, Wade said. No, it's not. She picked up her satchel. It's not because you came to town for fence wire on the right morning, and because Ruth kept her husband's records for 30 years out of sentiment, and because my father left me his case notes and his copying press and told me to go to the bottom of it. She looked at Wade. The bottom of it has a railroad company in it, and a man in St. Louis who did to 43 families in Missouri what Bross has been doing here. That changes what this is. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression had shifted the same brief, unguarded quality she had seen the previous night, and this time he let it stay for a moment longer before managing it back. It changes what's possible, he said quietly. They rode back to Colton Creek in the long afternoon light, and the return felt different from the going, not lighter exactly, but more settled, the way a problem feels different once you have named all its parts. They were 2 miles from town when Wade pulled up without warning, and she brought the roan around to face him. Purvis and 2 other men she didn't recognize were stopped in the road ahead, horses across the track blocking the way back to town. Purvis was holding a rifle across his saddle, casual and deliberate, the posture of a man who wants to communicate a message without quite stating it. Miss Hale, Purvis called. "Mr. Bross would like a word." "Mr. Bross knows where my office is," she said. "He thought you might prefer a conversation out here, more private." Wade had not moved except to shift his weight slightly forward and let his right hand drop to a relaxed position at his hip, and she recognized the posture from the livery stable, the posture of a man who knows exactly where the exits are and has already done the relevant arithmetic. "This is a public road," Wade said. His voice had not changed pitch at all. "Move aside." "I don't take orders from drifters," Purvis said. "I'm not giving you an order." Wade looked at him with the complete steadiness of a man who has been in enough situations like this one to know that steadiness itself is a weapon. "I'm telling you what's going to happen next, so you have the chance to choose how it goes. You're blocking a public road with 2 men and a rifle to threaten a woman carrying legal documents relating to a federal investigation." He paused, letting that land. "The choice in front of you is whether you're a witness or a defendant when the federal marshal arrives in 2 days. Purvis's eyes moved to the word federal with the involuntary reflex of a man who had not been expecting it. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice had lost some of its ease. "Am I?" Wade held his gaze without expression. "Think carefully about whether you believe that. And then think about whether Harlan Bross is going to be in a position to protect you from federal charges when this is done, or whether he's going to have enough problems of his own that you're on your own." The 2 men behind Purvis exchanged a look. One of them, the younger one, shifted his horse sideways, almost imperceptibly. Purvis sat in the road for a long moment. Then he lowered the rifle, not all the way, but enough to change the statement it was making, and pulled his horse to the side. They rode through without hurrying. Caroline did not look back, and neither did Wade, and they did not speak until the rooftops of Colton Creek appeared on the horizon. "How certain are you about the federal marshal?" she asked. "Reasonably certain," he said. "Delaney has Warfield's name now. That's not a local matter anymore. That's a man with a federal record of corporate fraud operating in 2 states. He glanced at her. "How certain are you that the documents in Ruth's cellar are sufficient to convict?" "Completely certain," Caroline said. "I've read every page. The evidence is there." She paused. "It's always been there. Bross made one mistake. He forgot that the people he was stealing from might someday find someone who knew how to read what he'd written." She said it quietly, without triumph, because it was not a triumph yet. But it was the truth of how this had begun, and what had made it possible, and she believed in stating the truth of things plainly. Her father had taught her that too. Arthur Delaney's reply came the following morning. Caroline was at her desk when Gus Weber knocked on the staircase door, which told her that whatever was in the wire was something he had decided to deliver in person, rather than send by the boy who usually ran messages. She opened the door, and he handed her the folded paper and looked at the floor and said quietly that he was sorry about his mother's mortgage and that he hoped she understood. She looked at him for a moment. He was 19 years old, and his hands were not entirely steady. "I understand," she said. "Thank you for bringing this yourself." He went back down the stairs without another word, and she unfolded the wire. Delaney had written 7 lines. A federal marshal and a document examiner were already en route from Austin. They would arrive by end of day tomorrow. He had contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding Theodore Warfield and been informed that Warfield was already under a preliminary inquiry related to the Missouri acquisitions, an inquiry that had stalled for lack of sufficient documentation from the field. He asked her to secure all physical evidence and make no further public statements until the marshal arrived. And at the bottom, in the compressed shorthand of a man who had been a friend of her father's for 20 years, "Your father would have been proud. Hold the line one more day." She read it twice, then folded it, and sat with it in her hands for a moment, and allowed herself the luxury of a single long breath before she stood up and went to find Wade. He was at Ruth's store, which had become, in the space of 3 days, the operational center of something none of them had planned to be running. Ruth had cleared the back table, and Wade was there with the property transfer records spread in sequence, a timeline written in his steady hand on a sheet of brown wrapping paper, cross-referencing the seizure dates against the railroad's public land acquisition announcements in the Austin papers, which Ruth had been saving in a box under the counter since 1876, out of the habit of a woman who saved everything that might someday matter. Caroline set Delaney's wire on the table in front of him. He read it. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Ruth, who had come to stand at the end of the table, and Ruth read it over his shoulder, and the three of them stood in the quiet of the back room with the weight of it settling around them, like something that had been suspended for a long time and had finally found the ground. "Tomorrow," Ruth said. "Tomorrow," Caroline confirmed. Ruth put her hand flat on the table and nodded once, the firm, decisive nod of a woman who has been patient a long time and can be patient one more day. "Then we give them everything they need to finish it." The hearing was scheduled for noon. The marshal was not expected until late afternoon at the earliest. That gap, 4 hours, perhaps 5, was the last thing Bross had working in his favor, and they all knew it. "He'll try to get a ruling before the marshal arrives," Wade said. "If the council issues a formal finding of professional misconduct, even a preliminary one, it creates a public record that complicates the federal case." "Can he do that in one hearing?" Caroline asked. "With his brother-in-law running the proceeding and the marshal not attending?" He met her eyes. Yes. She thought about that. She thought about it carefully and thoroughly, the way her father had taught her to think about problems, not around the edges, but straight through the center of them. She thought about what she had and what she didn't have, and what the next 18 hours needed to produce. "Then I need to do 2 things before noon tomorrow," she said. "I need to establish in a form Bross can't dismiss that this proceeding is connected to a federal investigation. And I need witnesses at that hearing who are not me." "Ruth," Wade said. "Ruth." Caroline agreed. "And Thomas Alderman. And Walt Henniger, if he'll come." She paused. "And you." Wade looked at her steadily. "My testimony won't help. Bross will use St. Louis." "Bross will try to use St. Louis. But you're not there as a character witness. You're there as a former professional investigator who reviewed the documents and can testify to the pattern of falsification independent of my reading." She held his gaze. "Your history with Warfield doesn't disqualify your professional assessment of what's in those contracts. It contextualizes it. It shows the federal connection has 2 independent sources, not 1. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been building this argument since this morning." "Since last night, actually." She picked up Delaney's wire from the table. "While you were sleeping." Something moved across his face, that brief, unguarded quality. The same one she had seen twice before, and this time there was something in it she recognized despite herself. The recognition of a woman who had spent 3 years protecting herself from exactly this kind of recognition. It was warmth, plain and unglamorous, directed at her specifically, and it had nothing in it of the performance that warmth from men had so often carried in her experience. She looked back at the documents on the table, before she could examine her own response to it too closely. There was work to do. They spent the afternoon preparing. Caroline wrote out her formal statement, a precise document setting forth the evidence of forgery in the Alderman Pierce and Henniger, contracts, the pattern established by Ruth's property records, and the connection to Colton Creek Land Associates and Theodore Warfield. Wade reviewed each paragraph against the physical documents, flagging any claim that needed stronger citation, the same systematic check he had applied to everything from the first night. Ruth wrote her own statement in the careful, schooled hand of a woman who had been clerk of her church council for 15 years and knew exactly how to set down testimony that would hold up to scrutiny. Thomas Alderman arrived at Ruth's store at 4 in the afternoon, having ridden in from where he was staying at his brother's place, east of town. He was a big-framed man who had been worn down to the bones of himself by the past 6 weeks, and he sat at Ruth's back table and listened to Caroline explain what she had found, with the stillness of a man who has been told devastating news and is now being told that the devastation was not his fault and that there is a path through it. When she finished, he sat for a long moment without speaking. "They're going to try to give it back," he said finally. His voice was careful the way voices get when a person is holding hope at arm's length to protect themselves from it. If the federal case proceeds and the seizure is found to be based on a fraudulent contract, yes, the property transfers would be void. She said it plainly because he deserved plainness. "I can't promise you the timeline. Federal cases move slowly, but the legal basis for recovering the property is solid." He put both hands flat on the table and stared at them for a moment. Then he looked up. "What do you need me to do?" "Come to the hearing tomorrow. Sit in that room. Let Bross's brother-in-law look at the face of a man whose family land was stolen by a forged initial." She held his gaze. "And if they ask you to speak, tell the truth about what happened." "I can do that," Thomas Alderman said, and for the first time since he had walked into Ruth's store, something in his bearing shifted a fraction of the weight he was carrying, redistributed as if the act of having a specific task had returned to him, something that helplessness had taken. Walt Henniger, when Ruth sent word to him in the room behind the store, came through the connecting door 5 minutes later in his good shirt, which Ruth had clearly pressed for him at some point, and said only, "Tell me where to be and when," and went back to his room to get his hat. That night, Caroline sat at her small table at Mrs. Foss's and read through her father's case notes one more time, not because she needed to, but because it was the last night before whatever tomorrow was going to be, and she wanted his voice in the room with her. His handwriting was precise and slightly old-fashioned, the hand of a man trained in the 1840s, and she had been reading it since she was old enough to read anything at all. He had written near the back of the notes on the Alderman file, in the unsteady hand of his last weeks. "The work is not about the documents. The documents are only proof. The work is about the people the documents were used against and the restoration of what was taken from them. Never forget that distinction. Evidence is the means. Justice is the purpose." She closed the notebook and sat with her hand on the cover. A knock at the window. The outside staircase window 2 stories up, which meant someone had climbed the staircase to her room rather than knocking at the front door. Her hand went to the derringer on the table before she recognized the knock's rhythm, 2 short, 1 long. Ruth's signal established yesterday. She opened the window. It was not Ruth. It was Wade standing on the narrow landing, his hat in his hand, looking not at all comfortable about being there. "I climbed the back staircase," he said. "I didn't want to disturb Mrs. Foss." She stepped back from the window, and he came in, ducking his head under the frame, and stood in the small room with the particular awareness of a man conscious of being in a space he doesn't belong in. "Something's wrong," she said. Not a question. "Purvis left town this afternoon. One of the men from the road yesterday left this morning." He turned his hat in his hands. "They're not coming to the hearing. Bross is pulling his muscle out before the marshal arrives." She thought about what that meant. He's going to run. Not yet. He needs the hearing first. One more institutional action on his record before he disappears, a finding of misconduct against you. Something he can point to if he's ever caught as evidence that the accusations were the work of a disgruntled woman who was censured for them. Wade looked at her. "He wants that on paper. Then he's gone." And Warfield. Warfield is already untouchable unless the federal case has physical evidence from this county. Without the documents, without the witnesses, Warfield's prior inquiry stalls again. His voice was steady, but she could hear what was underneath it. The 3 years of carrying this, the 43 families in Missouri, the weight of one more time, watching the machinery of it operate and being unable to stop it. If Bross gets that ruling tomorrow and leaves with the documents he has access to in the bank, the original contracts, the land associates' paperwork, he buries as much of the trail as he can, and Warfield walks away again. She looked at him for a long moment. "He doesn't have the copies," she said. "No. And he doesn't know what Delaney already has in Austin. The land associates filing. Warfield's name." She moved to the table and picked up the folder of copied documents. The copies in Ruth's cellar, and the originals in my strongbox, and everything I've already sent to Delaney, that's enough for the federal case with or without the originals from the bank. Is it enough to convict Warfield? She thought about her father's handwriting, about what evidence was for. It's enough to open the Missouri case back up. With the Texas evidence establishing the pattern, the Missouri families have grounds for a federal civil claim, even if the criminal case takes years. She set the folder down. It's not everything, but it's not nothing either. No, Wade said quietly. It's not nothing. They stood in the small room with that between them, and she was aware with the same precise clarity she brought to everything of how much had happened in 4 days, how much had shifted, how completely different the landscape of what she considered possible had become since the morning she had walked into Harlan Bross's bank with the alderman contract and walked out bleeding. "Why did you come tonight?" she asked. "You could have told me this in the morning." He looked at her steadily. "Because you've been alone in this room for 3 hours, and tomorrow is a hard day, and I—" He stopped, turned his hat in his hands once more. The slight roughness in his composure was something she had only seen once before in the stable when he had talked about John Pierce's boy. "I wanted to make sure you weren't alone with it." Caroline looked at Wade Calloway, who had come to Colton Creek for fence wire, and stayed because a man named John Pierce had a 12-year-old son who had sat at her copying press for an entire night, handling carbon paper with the lightness of a man who understood that careful work mattered, who had handed her the satchel instead of keeping it, and stood aside when Purvis blocked the road and said "your call," as if her judgment was a fact he had accepted without reservation. She had been wrong once about a man. She had paid for it, and learned from it, and built her life afterward on the principle that documents didn't lie if you knew how to read them, and people mostly did. She had applied that principle to Wade Calloway from the first hour in the stable, reading him the way her father had taught her, not the surface, but the weight of things, the deliberateness of how they'd been assembled, what they revealed about the person who'd made them. What she had found reading carefully over 4 days was a man without performance in him, a man who said what he meant and meant what he did, and had ridden away from a comfortable position in St. Louis rather than be the instrument of an injustice he could not unknow. A man who carried 43 families in Missouri the way she carried her father's. Last words, not as guilt, but as obligation. The kind of obligation that comes from knowing something and being unable to pretend you don't. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat. She made coffee on the small spirit stove, and they drank it at the table by the window with the night outside, and the documents between them and the hearing 12 hours away. And they talked until past midnight. Not about the case, not about tomorrow, but about Baltimore and St. Louis, and what it meant to build something of your own in a place that didn't know your name yet, and what it meant to lose it, and what it meant to start again. She told him about her father pressing the alderman file into her hands, and she told him about the man she had been engaged to and the 2 years she had spent learning to trust her own reading again afterward. She told him these things in the same plain direct voice she used for everything, because she had decided some time between the stable and this moment that Wade Calloway had earned the plain truth of things. He told her about his wife, who had been dead 4 years, and who had loved the Missouri River in the early morning, and had never once complained about the life they were building, and how he had understood, when he lost her, that grief and guilt felt identical from the inside, and it had taken him a long time to separate them. They sat with all of it without trying to resolve it or make it smaller, and somewhere in that sitting, without ceremony or announcement, something settled between them that had been unsettled since the first moment in the stable when he had handed her the satchel and she had made the first entry in the document of him she had been building ever since. He left before Mrs. Foss's household stirred down the back staircase in the early dark, and Caroline sat at her table and looked at her father's case notes one last time, and felt for the first time since he died something that was not grief and not the controlled purposefulness she had been running on for 4 months, but something older and quieter and more sustaining than either. The hearing convened at noon in the town council room, and Harlan Bross arrived with Dodd and 3 council members and his brother-in-law, Percy Crane, in the chair, and he looked across the room at Caroline sitting at the respondents' table with Wade on her left, and Ruth and Thomas Alderman, and Walt Henniger in the chairs behind her, and she watched him recalculate. She set her father's case notes on the table. She set the copied documents organized by date and contract number. She set Arthur Delaney's wire. "Before this proceeding begins," she said, "before Percy Crane could call it to order, I wish to enter into the record a communication from the Federal Land Office in Austin advising that this matter is currently subject to a federal investigation and that a United States Marshal is en route to Colton Creek and expected to arrive this afternoon." Percy Crane looked at his brother-in-law. Bross looked at the wire in Caroline's hand with the expression of a man watching a wall he thought he had built prove insufficient. She did not look away from him when she said it. She wanted him to see clearly, and without ambiguity, that she had read him the same way she had read his contracts carefully, completely, all the way to the forged initials he had thought were buried deep enough that no one with the knowledge to find them would ever be looking. He had made the oldest mistake in fraud. He had believed that the architecture of his respectability was more solid than the evidence against him. He had forgotten that every document tells the truth about the person who wrote it to anyone who knows how to read it. The federal marshal arrived at 3:30. He had a document examiner with him who spent 40 minutes with the original alderman contract and rendered a written opinion confirming that the initials on page 37 had been produced by a different hand than the signature on page 1. He had in his leather case a warrant for Harlan Bross's arrest on charges of federal land fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, and a second warrant for Theodore Warfield in St. Louis. Bross was taken into custody on the steps of the bank at 4 o'clock, and the street that had watched Caroline bleed on its boards 4 days earlier came out of its doors and its silence and watched Harlan Bross in handcuffs, and no one looked away. 6 months later, Colton Creek Land Associates was dissolved by federal order, and the property transfers executed through it were voided. Thomas Alderman moved his family back to the land they had built, and his wife planted her kitchen garden in the same plot where it had grown before. Walt Henniger had his house returned to him, and the first thing he did was fix the front porch step that had been broken since the spring of 1877, and that he had been intending to repair when everything was taken from him. Theodore Warfield was indicted in St. Louis on charges that drew partly on the Texas evidence and partly on documents that had existed in the Missouri federal files for 3 years, waiting for the thread from Colton Creek to pull them into coherence. He was convicted the following year. Wade Calloway did not go back to St. Louis. He expanded his fence line east and built a proper barn, and by the following spring had 60 head of cattle and 1 border collie, who had arrived as a stray and decided to stay, which was, he told Caroline, a pattern he had some personal acquaintance with. They were married in Ruth McAllister's store on a Thursday afternoon in October because Ruth had the largest room and the most chairs, and because it was where the 3 of them had sat around a table with property records and wrapping paper and figured out that the bottom of a thing, when you were willing to go to it, sometimes turned out to be solid ground. Caroline kept her office above Decker's feed store. She kept her father's case notes and his copying press and his collection of contract law books, and she added to it steadily over the years, case by case, client by client, building the practice he had left her into something the county came to rely on. She was not the only woman in Texas practicing financial and legal document work, but she was the one people came to when the document in question mattered most, when the stakes were highest. When someone needed to know that the person reading the fine print would read every word of it and not stop until they reached the bottom. She and Wade ate dinner together every evening at the rough-hewn table he had made himself, and on the nights when the case she was working was complicated, and the weight of it sat with her through the meal. He would ask her to walk him through it, not because he always understood every clause, but because he had learned, as she had, that the clearest thinking happens when someone is genuinely listening. And she would walk him through it precisely and completely the way her father had walked her through problems since she was 12 years old. And by the time she reached the end of it, she would know what she needed to know. She never stopped being the woman who read everything twice. She never stopped keeping copies in the strongbox and the key on the chain around her neck and the derringer in the desk drawer. She never stopped being the woman who had stood in Harlan Bross's bank with a forged contract in her hands and refused to be the kind of wrong he had calculated she would be. But she was also, after October of 1878, the woman who came home to a man who understood that the most important thing he could do for a person he loved was to hand them their own satchel and trust them to carry it, and who had learned in the doing of it that a woman who carries her own weight will still sometimes reach for yours. In Colton Creek in the years that followed, people came to understand something that Harlan Bross had understood too late, that the most dangerous thing you can do to a woman with her father's case notes and her father's copying press is to assume that the architecture of your respectability is more solid than her willingness to read what you have written. Carolyn Hale Reed had known how to go to the bottom of things her whole life. She had simply at last found someone willing to go there with her, and the bottom, when they reached it together, turned out to hold not the end of the story, but the ground on which everything else was built.